Okay, moving right along. I've got my tubes made. They're about 8 inches long. They're probably gonna get cut off shorter later on. They're 2.5 inches in diameter, and they're very, smooth and straight, consistent wall thickness and inside diameter, very important. And I've created these dark rings which will be positioned on the tube with the combination locking rings positioned in between. So the next step, I'm going to start working at building these rings. I've taken a variety of species of wood here, milled them all to about 3/4 of an inch thick, and they've all got one edge that's relatively straight. Because they're narrow, they have to have support in order to cut. So I've moved my stop block away from the blade just a little bit in order to put a bevel or a miter cut on one edge of all these pieces. So one after the other, I'll put a bevel on one side of all this wood. Here's my first cuts. Now it's a matter of adjusting the stop block to do the other side. Always check that underside. The nails sometimes bulge the material and prevent it from seating or sitting really nice and flat. I've got to do a test ring here because the width of these staves is pretty critical. So I'm going to cut a couple of staves, then I'm going to go over to my chop saw and chop these up into some short lengths in order to put a ring together. I need the inside diameter of these rings to be slightly smaller than the outside diameter of my tubes. But before I can test these staves, I need some veneers. I'm going to put vertical black veneer between all these staves. So I've gang cut some little pieces of veneer here and assembled a ring. Well, it turns out it's a little too small. So another test. I've adjusted my stop and I'll cut a couple more staves, chop these up, and do the same thing all over again. Hopefully I've enlarged this ring just enough. Here it is, and it looks pretty good. So I'm going to proceed to cut my staves. With my width determined, now it's just a matter of putting that same bevel on the other side of all those previously cut one-sided staves. Here is my assortment of different woods all ready to be chopped into short staves. But how tall should they be? Well, I've got about 5 inches left on this tube, and I'll need some extra material at the ends of the tube in order to fit up the end caps. So I've decided to cut these at about 0.9 inches. The final rings will probably be milled or turned down to about 0.8 inches. I've got all these nice little short staves to play with. Now it's a matter of arranging them into a pleasing arrangement of colors and to determine what kind of design I may want to make. My first one here on the left, that's not going to have an arrangement of colors. I'm going to burn some symbols. The other two are going to have an arrangement. This one is using tulip wood in the shape of a diamond, and this other one is going to form an X out of the kingwood. Now before I can glue my rings together, I need these little pieces of veneer, so I've gang cut a whole bunch of those just to have them ready. The glue job is just like any other ring, except I've got vertical grain instead of horizontal. I'm buttering all the surfaces. I'm using Type Bond 3. It'll give me a little more working time, but I have to work pretty fast. There's 16 little staves, there's 16 pieces of veneer, 32 pieces, 64 surfaces need glue. You'll notice I'm not using the half ring technique. I'm very confident in my fits, and if I have a bad joint, I can always make a new ring to replace it. Now I've waited at least a few hours, maybe more. Off the rubber bands come, and I can do an inspection. I'll go to the disc sander and put a nice clean smooth surface on one side of all these. That will allow me to put them on this board of melamine with these thin strips of double-sided tape. Multiple passes through the drum sander, starting with 36 grit, ending with 120 grit. Now I've got very precise thicknesses or heights. Here I've stacked my components next to the tubes. This confirms that I've got enough tube length. I'll need a little extra tube length in order to install the end caps. To dimension my rings for my tubes, I'm using some extra large jaws on my chuck.
And as you noticed, I put a little spacer in there, about a 1/4 inch thick, in order to turn the inside of this without danger of making contact with the steel jaws. This is just a matter of sneaking up on the fit, a little turning, a check, constantly back and forth. I'm using one of the Easy Wood carbide tools here. I'm turning reverse there. But it's just a matter of turn, check until you get the right fit. Here I'm using a different tool. This is just a diamond pointed scraper. It does the same thing. A little radius on the inside corners can't hurt. It might help these things rotate more freely. So here are my 15 rotating rings. They're looking pretty good. Time to get working on the outsides. To turn the outsides, I've compared it to these separator rings, and I've decided I'm going to take minimum off the outside. I've changed the jaws on my chuck in order to clamp these in expansion mode. I'm using my little diamond pointed scraper. That point will allow me to get to that far edge because it's fairly close to the steel over there. This is just an easier, safer way to do it. Notice I haven't done anything on the edges. Here I've just checking the diameters, making sure I've got consistent diameters. Now to get a consistent radius on those edges, instead of turning, I'm going to just run them around this little tiny rounding bit on a router. This will give me a starting point so I have a pretty consistent radius on all those corner edges. Once these are radiused, I'll go back to the lathe, do some sanding, clean them up. But before that, I'm putting a little bandsaw cut about 1/16 of an inch deep right on the veneer. This will give the rings a little more grip for people moving them. The saw curve from the bandsaw I'm cleaning up, widening it up a little bit with this tiny Dremel bit. Then I can go back to my lathe, put them on this post, and pretty quickly, sand up through the grits, without stopping the lathe. This is a big time saver, just as I did with the separator rings. A little inspection. One last little clean up on those grooves. I'm using one of these little plastic bristle brushes, getting all the dust off them, and then going over, putting a first of a couple of coats of sanding sealer. Coating all the surfaces, wiping off any excess, and letting these dry for a number of hours at least. Then I'll go back to my table. This is a few hours later. I'll go back to the table and buff these. Here I've got about a 220 grit sanding mop. Here's another way to do it. The mop has now been mounted in the lathe. And here are all my components with their second coat of sanding sealer.